industrial accidents,
ancient
solving
poisoners,
crime,
poison
chemical
prevention.
spills. This is Toxic History.
Dr. Adam Overberg is a board-certified clinical toxicologist and the director of the Indiana Poison Center.
So my presentation today is on the one-man environmental disaster. I have no disclosures. So our objectives today are going to be to review the history of tetraethyl lead as a gasoline additive, discuss the clinical features and public health ramifications, and examine the legacy of Thomas Midgley Jr. So join me as we travel back through time to the early 20th century when gas-powered automobiles were starting to explode in popularity. We're in the 1910s and early 1920s. They were becoming more accessible to the general public. And that popularity brought demands for better performance and efficiency and comfort, and manufacturers were in an arms race to provide those with new designs and technologies and materials. As has always been the case, power was in high demand, but at that time, fuel efficiency was also a critical factor because the US faced a rapidly dwindling supply of domestic oil. So, a quick review of the internal combustion engine. A four-stroke engine, which is typically what you'll find in cars, has an intake step, a compression step, and then the ignition, and then an exhaust stroke. One way to increase power and fuel efficiency was to increase an engine's compression ratio, which is the ratio between how much volume it can hold and how compact the piston can squeeze the fuel-air mixture. Higher compression ratios allow more complete burning at a lower temperature and use less fuel, but that also presents new engineering challenges. Engine knock was one of the major ones. This is a phenomenon that occurs when the air-fuel mixture auto-ignites instead of being ignited by the spark plug as designed. And this animation shows what that would look like. It reduces efficiency, and if it's bad enough, it can even damage the piston. This was especially problematic in aviation engines, and it became an area of really intense study in the mid to late 1910s into World War I. Enter Thomas Midgley Jr. Midgley was born in 1889, about an hour northwest of Pittsburgh. His father was an inventor, and his maternal grandfather was also an inventor, and it seems to be genetic. He definitely picked it up from them also. He moved around a little bit in his early years, but the family finally settled in Columbus, Ohio. He grew up there, and foreshadowing of what was to come, he, in high school, came up with the idea of using the slippery elm bark to throw spitballs in baseball, which was all the rage at that time. While he was in high school, he had a high school chemistry teacher who sparked in him a love of the periodic table. And in fact, he would carry around a copy of the periodic table with him for years afterward. After high school, he went to Cornell for mechanical engineering, graduated in 1911. And then for the first year, he worked at the National Cash Register Company. And then his father asked him to come work with him. His father had a company that was designing car tires. And Thomas quickly rose in that company. He became chief engineer and then superintendent of the company. But the company eventually did fold. And at that point, he went to go work for Charles Kettering, yes, that Kettering, at the Dayton Engineering Labs Company. In his early years at Delco, Thomas Midgley had just success after success. He solved problems that nobody else was really able to solve. He was really cranking out innovation after innovation, including developing a synthetic aviation gas that was 70% cyclohexane and 30% benzene that reduced a lot of the issues with knocking in that setting. He wasn't given much of a laboratory. It was not all that well equipped. So he either invented or improved on most or all of the instruments and tools that he needed to conduct his experiments. He was also a dramatic showman. He liked to demonstrate his inventions, and he had a knack for doing it in ways that non-scientists could understand. He was no stranger to heavy metals. He had an occupational accident during his time at Delco that left him with metal shards embedded in his cornea. After physicians were unable to remove them, he designed and used some purified mercury eye drops to remove those pieces, and seemed to be successful as he regained sight in that eye. His experience with that avgas during World War II led him to realize that it was the molecular structure of the fuel, not its density or volatility, as had previously been thought, that actually caused the knocking. The first breakthrough was when Kettering sold Delco and started a new company that eventually became the General Motors Research Corporation. He brought Midgley on as a director and vice president, and their work focused on trying additives to reduce knock. So in that 5 year span leading up to 1921, they tried things as diverse as camphor, melted butter, hundreds of other compounds. Um, and then at one point, Kettering noticed a plant called the trailing arbutus, which is pictured there on the slide, had red flowers that bloomed under the snow, and he theorized that the red pigment was important for heat absorption and then might actually be helpful for solving engine knock. There weren't any oil-soluble red dyes available, so they tried using iodine instead, and that was wildly successful. It reduced knock almost to zero, but unfortunately, it was also very corrosive. It was also very expensive. Um, Adding iodine to all gas used at that point would have cost over $1 a gallon, which was astronomical in those days. So, if iodine is too corrosive and too expensive, would other red dyes have an effect? They tried some aniline dyes and didn't have any luck with that. They tried ethyl iodide and did have results. And Thomas Midgley realized that color was actually a red herring. So, seizing on that, he broke out his trusty periodic table and began looking for some better alternatives. And he did a really systematic study of similar elements and compounds. He tested compounds of iodine, nitrogen, phosphorus, arsenic, antimony, selenium, and tellurium. Most of these were ineffective, but there were a few good candidates that he found. Unfortunately, many of the best of those were smelly. For example, diethyl telluride caused, in Midgley's words, a satanified garlic odor so powerful that a change of clothing and a bath at the end of the day did not reduce your ability as a tellurium broadcasting station, nor did the odor grow much weaker when several days were passed in absence from the laboratory. So that wasn't going to work. He decided to go one column to the left on the periodic table, and he hit pay dirt with tetraethyl tin. It worked. It did reduce knocking. It wasn't smelly. But then he wondered, could we do better? So he decided, what about lead? Let's go one row down on the periodic table. Chemically, it should behave the same way. It should be very similar. And lead had some advantages. It was extremely, extremely cheap. It was readily available. It was often mined as a waste product with more valuable things like silver. It was very easily smelted and purified because it had such a low melting point. So he said, how about that? Downside is it's lead, and we are familiar with all of the horrific symptoms of lead poisoning, and that was a concern at first. So Thomas Midgley decided to proceed with developing tetraethyl lead. He did some early modeling, and the models were favorable. And so he had the lab at the GM Research Corporation synthesize him a small amount of tetraethyl lead. He conducted some tests, and great success. Even a few drops of tetraethyl lead were wildly successful in reducing knock. and did not cause any harm to the engine, and it was not smelly or otherwise intolerable. But there were some issues that he still had to solve. The way that tetraethyl lead solves NOx is when it burns, it separates into inorganic lead and ethyl radicals. The inorganic lead would then, as it cooled, deposit onto the surfaces of the engine, which could cause mechanical problems and eventually engine failure. So he had to figure out a way to keep the lead from building up in the engine. His team quickly identified 1,2-dibromoethane, which it reacted with the inorganic lead and formed lead bromide, which was blown out in the exhaust and didn't harm the engine. Well, so that was great, except at that time, bromine was extremely expensive and only available from a single source, which was the Dow Chemical Company. To scale this up and to make it commercially viable, he had to find another source of bromine. So he undertook a side quest and developed a process to extract bromine from ocean water, where it was present in about 65 parts per million, so fairly dilute, but could be extracted at a commercially viable scale. He built a couple plants on the East Coast and then a large scale one in Texas. And then GM then contracted with DuPont in 1922 to actually perform the manufacturing of tetraethyl lead. This was not an out of the blue occurrence. There was a brother-brother relationship between members of the boards of these companies. And so that's how the contract came to be awarded. So, with every hurdle seemingly out of the way, the commercialization of tetraethyl lead started to ramp up. This is where it gets rather anger-inducing. GM and DuPont knew from early testing that this was going to release lead into the environment. Every gallon would put out about 4 grams of lead oxide, and many scientists of the time wrote letters to Midgley and asked him not to pursue this additive, this creeping and malicious poison that would build up in the environment and the air and roads and tunnels. They knew that tetraethyl lead itself was highly toxic. The president of GM, Pierre DuPont, wrote that it was a colorless liquid of sweetish odor, very poisonous if absorbed through the skin, resulting in lead poisoning almost immediately. Around this time, so this was 1922, the US Surgeon General wrote to GM expressing some public health concerns, and Thomas Midgley himself replied, saying that the concerns had been given very serious consideration, but no actual experimental data has been taken. Nonetheless, the average street will probably be so free from lead that it will be impossible to detect it or its absorption. All of this came just as he was preparing for a vacation in Miami for some fresh air because he himself was dealing with some mild lead poisoning. And that didn't really stop them. They marketed this heavily anyway. Yay, capitalism. When tetraethyl lead hit the market, it first went on sale February 1st of 1923, and it was advertised as ethyl because any mention of lead would be an immediate no for so many people. It would be just immediate media circus. Midgley, ever the showman, demoed the substance for the press. He poured tetraethyl lead over his hands. He inhaled the fumes. And at that press conference, while doing so, he said, "I'm not taking any chance whatsoever, nor would I take any chance doing that every day." That's wild. A few months later, the Indy 500 took place, and the top 3 finishers all used tetraethyl lead. And after that, the interest of the public absolutely skyrocketed. Midgley estimated that they could expect about 20% of the US fuel supply to use tetraethyl lead, and that their gross profit would be in the dozens of millions of dollars. Then some signs of trouble started to emerge. Factory workers started to show signs of lead poisoning. Their plant in Deepwater, New Jersey was known as the House of Butterflies because so many employees had insect hallucinations. Charles Kettering blamed the workers and said that they were playing with tetraethyl lead and leaving it out in uncovered vats and not using PPE, despite being told not to. So that was um, an excellent display of behavior. And then in 1923, the U.S. Bureau of Mines conducted a test where animals were exposed to exhaust from a engine running using leaded gas. And their conclusion was that leaded gas was without harm of any kind. However, GM had reserved rights for comment, criticism, and approval of the results of this study. The behavior continued. In August of the following year, GM and DuPont partnered up with Standard Oil. Always a great sign when you can get Standard Oil on your side that you know everything's going to go great. And they formed the Ethyl Gasoline Corporation. Kettering was president, Midgley was vice president, and they started production in September of 1924. In October of 1924, 5 workers died, and more than 40 had irreversible neurologic injuries, in addition to several dozen additional that were hospitalized. And the factory had actually had to briefly shut down. Again, victim blaming was the name of the day. The chief chemist said these men probably went insane because they worked too hard. DuPont and GM also saw deaths in their factories manufacturing these products. And as a result, New York, New Jersey, and Philadelphia suspended sale of leaded gas. Surgeon General again stepped in, did an inquiry into the injuries and deaths, and concluded that there was no firm evidence of public threat. However, the authors of the panel members that put out that study concluded that the study period was too short and that further studies were needed. The public indeed took that as a clean bill of health, and sales resumed shortly thereafter. The use of leaded gasoline spread incredibly rapidly, and the innovations didn't stop there. In 1960, the derivative tetramethyl lead was introduced. It was a little bit less expensive and easier to produce, and that further increased the popularity. And by 1963, more than 98% of the US gas supply contained lead additives. And the companies were very aggressive about that. There was one tetraethyl lead company that was able to successfully sue an unleaded gas maker who touted that their alternative unleaded gas was able to stand on its own merits without the need for dangerous chemicals. So they won that lawsuit. The FTC also released a statement saying that tetraethyl lead is entirely safe to the health of motorists and the public, not a narcotic, a poisonous dope, dangerous to life or health of a customer, purchaser, user, or the general public. Wow. So enter geology grad student Claire Patterson, who was doing experiments trying to determine the age of rocks using isotopes of lead and uranium. However, he was finding really, really high concentrations of lead, more than 200 times more than expected in his samples. So he performed some really painstaking experiments and realized that this was coming from an atmospheric source. He continued on his research. In 1953, he was able to reliably date the Earth to 4.55 billion years old, which is still an accurate number today. And then after he was finished with that, he took on the issue of atmospheric lead. In 1965, he proposed taking core samples of ice from Greenland and testing each layer. And what he found was essentially no atmospheric lead before 1923 and a sharp rise after that. In fact, the 1965 level was more than 1,000 times the pre-ethyl era. He also did some testing of human bones and found levels hundreds of times higher than previous to that date. The Ethyl Corporation, as you might expect, did not take kindly to this. They tried to hire him to get him to stop publishing damaging results. And when that didn't work, They applied other pressure, including having the National Research Council panel on atmospheric lead contamination completely ignore him. They had a Supreme Court justice. They had members of the U.S. Public Health Service and the money of the American Petroleum Institute that they all brought to bear on him in his professional capacities. Finally, 1970 brought an inflection point. Claire Patterson's efforts eventually were important in the passage of the 1970 Clean Air Act, which included a phase out of tetraethyl lead that was mandated in stages between 1982 and 1986. Ethel Gas Corp and DuPont actually sued the FDA, claiming actual harm must be demonstrated rather than just significant risk. So they were able to delay that ban, the full ban, for another decade after that. The other factor that occurred in 1970 was the emergence of catalytic converters. They contained a palladium-based catalyst that was meant to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, nitrous oxide compound emissions, but they also had the effect of the lead bromide destroyed the palladium-based catalyst permanently, and so the leaded gasoline kind of fell out of favor for commercial reasons as well as legal reasons. So the end result is that leaded gas was virtually eliminated by 1986, and blood lead levels of adults in the US have dropped by 78% since that time. So to sum up, it was leaded additives were legal for 63 years, and it's estimated that more than 7 million tons of tetraethyl lead was burned. Every single bit of that lead is still present in the environment. Some of it has fallen to earth as dust, some of it is present in water, some of it is still in the air. There have also been a number of studies over the years that found an association between childhood exposure to lead and crime rates with a 20-year lag time. These studies were across a variety of places and social conditions and types of government. There's some debate over this association, but it's worth noting that the major drop in US crime rate that was seen in the early 90s lines up well with the phase out in the 1970s of tetraethyl lead. It's worth also noting that this is not ancient history. Leaded gases have only been fully banned nationwide within the last 10 years. Its use in on-road motor vehicles in the US was banned by 1995, but it was still allowed for off-road uses, including propeller aircraft, race cars, and marine engines. Most countries followed suit relatively quickly, but you could still buy organolead concentrates in Sweden and the Czech Republic. You could still buy leaded gas in Norway and South Africa, and Venezuela had no plans to reduce or eliminate leaded gas even as recently as like 2003. In fact, in 1996, 93% of all gas sold in Africa contained lead, 94% in the Middle East, 30% in Asia, and 35% in Latin America. It's possible that it may still be available in some developing countries. I've seen Iraq, Yemen, uh, Myanmar, and North Korea mentioned, and India and China are still getting a grip on the pollution left over from eliminating lead smelting. So back to our anti-hero. He was responsible for not just the massive lead poisoning of the Earth, but also the ozone depletion, the hole in the ozone layer, because he developed dichloro-difluoromethane, which is the first refrigerant. He eventually contracted polio and was strangled to death by his own invention. Leave you with these quotes. He had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth history. He had an instinct for the regrettable that was almost uncanny, and he was a one-man environmental disaster.